Alright, this is Spider-Man 53, part 4 of the story, where we get to see Ben Reilly, the clone of Spider-Man, fight Venom. I didn't think anyone would consider this their favourite Spider-Man story, but it is honestly not bad. It is engaging enough. It is just a fight. We have Ben Reilly versus Venom versus another Venom monster called Scream. She is like one of the Venom symbiote's grandchildren. She is quickly forgotten about in this issue. This is during the critically despised Spider-Man period known as the Clone Saga, where Marvel introduced or reintroduced a clone of Spider-Man and then tried to replace Spider-Man with the clone. In one of the other parts, I explained how I thought the Clone Saga could have worked, and for this story, it mostly works. Although it is this issue where we get the notion that the reason Ben Reilly beats Venom is because he is the real Spider-Man, whereas Peter Parker never could beat Venom himself. What I want to talk about this time is the 90s, the decade of comic books that certain comic book professionals decided to use as a scapegoat and a source of critical deflection. A lot of industry idiots harp on about the 90s being an awful time for comics and that the 90s were filled with terrible stories and awful art and bad ideas. And the Clone Saga is always brought up, and the Avengers story called The Cross-Dressing, that is always brought up. And those are bad stories, but they are not the standard of the time. There are plenty of good comic books from the 90s. There is Affinity Gauntlets from Marvel, which is one of their benchmark storylines. There's good Superman stuff at DC. The early 90s in particular were not bad. There was a lot of sales chasing and daft gimmicks, but you can either look past that or avoid those comics. There is plenty of good 90s stories. The Clone Saga is not one of them, and I want to bust this myth that I am a 90s apologist or that I am a defender of the Clone Saga or the cross-dressing. They are both bad overall, but there are some ideas or bits that I think have more worth than any of the petty retcons or criticism that people like writer Kurt Busey or editor Tom Beevort direct at them. Also, here is a subplot setting up our next story arc, which involves Unterman's son, his first son, and the one who was totally wasted. He was introduced in issue 50, and he will die in issue 55. The thing with the Clone Saga or the cross-dressing that makes them so bad, that makes them heartbreaking and disappointing, is that they are stories that people wrote, and they were trying to do a good comic book, but it went so wrong. The people involved with the Clone Saga never set out to write a bad story or such a horrible Spider-Man thing. I have a lot more sympathy for the Clone Saga than I do for Kurt Busey's Avengers Forever, which is 12 issues of him just spitefully changing and retconning every possible thing about the Avengers and their history, and undoing everything from the 90s. And with the 90s, for me, there is no nostalgia. The 90s is not my nostalgia. I'm not speaking from the perspective of people like Kurt Busey, who only read comics in the 70s and therefore ate everything outside of their comfort zone. I never read this story when it came out. I was 4 or 5. I do have nostalgia for one 90s Spider-Man story. The one where Ben Reilly wears the Carnage symbiote. And that is it. I've not actually read it since I was 8. But I imagine it maybe holds up. All this stuff here, or the Avengers stories from the 90s. I'm not saying the 90s were not as bad as they pretend just because I remember them fondly. I am saying it as someone who went back and read this stuff and realised it was not utterly rubbish. Even stuff like Excellent Force, which is mocked so much, or at least it was. We are in a period now where there is almost some 90s nostalgia seeping through into the comic industry, despite the gatekeepers. But Excellent Force, I remember 15 years ago, you would be laughed off of forums for saying that there was some good character work going on in that book, or that the series wasn't as bad as it was made out to be. For what it's worth, I need to mention that the 90s did get bad. Marvel went bankrupt. It all started around about this time, 1995. We had overrated writers like Martin Quaid or Kurt Busey taking over things and asserting their dominance. And ironically, the decade of comics they despise is also the decade that spawned their careers. They are really disingenuous like that. For example, Martin Quaid, he always lambasts the editor of the Excellent Men books, Bob Patrick Harris, for driving the franchise to ruin in the 90s. Bob Patrick Harris had oversaw the Excellent Men books for years. He had oversaw their greatest sales ever, and he had overseen the years when those books dominated the charts. Bob Patrick Harris was also the editor who brought on a new writer called Martin Quaid for the Onslaught Man crossover, which was the exact point in history when the Excellent Men books went off a cliff and stopped being a consistent juggernaut. Martin Quaid, he forgets that part of it, that he was directly involved in the demise of the Excellent Men's success in the 90s. And so these people came along and just started this myth that everything before them was rubbish to make their own work stand out as better. Oh, by the way, Kanye is in this one, the other Spider-Man clone. He watches this fight from the shadows. Bet you didn't see that coming. We will see a lot more of Kanye next story, if you want me to look at that. I do have a lot to say about Kanye. I didn't hate him as a concept. I think there is some potential in him. But I want to remind everyone that last time I compared him to Shadow the Hedgehog, and that was the most brilliant comparison anyone has ever made. He is Spider-Man's edgy, emo, anti-hero clone. As you would expect, Ben Reilly, he defeats Venom, and I have honestly talked so little about this actual issue that it feels bad even pretending that I have. And here is a nice image of Ben Reilly swinging away as we see various faces that will play a factor into his future overhead. I wasted this video mostly banging on about my aversion to the 90s bigotry of writers from the late 90s. Something that I have already spent plenty of videos yelling about. This one is, like a lot of comics from the 90s, one of those that is alright. There are tiny bits of bad ideas seeping in, but overall it is a fun 4-part story, and it gives Ben Reilly something to do besides be a bit of drama and an ugly swap out for the real Spider-Man. I'll give this issue a pleasant 7 thumbs up.